Oh, hey buddy, it's your old pal Scott, and this is Let's Talk Tabletop. Now, I'm a lifelong Star Trek fan, if you can't tell by my t-shirt, or my poster, or my miniatures, or any of that. But, it seems like Star Wars gets all the love. We currently have both Star Wars Legion and Star Wars Shatterpoint, as well as Imperial Assault in the past and all of that. And it always seems like Star Trek doesn't get the same amount of miniatures wargame love that Star Wars does. So why don't we dive into why that's the case? Because I know exactly why that's the case, and why we may never see a Star Trek Legion. Star Trek is one of the most recognizable sci-fi properties in the entire history of mankind. It's up there with things like Battlestar Galactica and Star Wars, and it's kind of shocking that it hasn't gotten a miniatures skirmish game or miniatures mass battle game on the tabletop with soldiers, etc. But I think we can all agree that Star Trek has never had the same mass appeal with the general audience that Star Wars has had, despite having far more minutes of screen time with all of the different shows, the hundreds of episodes, and the dozens of movies. It's got far more content to draw from. But unfortunately, a lot of that content is not very useful for a miniatures wargame, unfortunately. Star Wars. What is Star Wars about? Star Wars is about war, right? Star Wars Shatterpoint, Star Wars Legion. You've got soldiers, you've got troops. It's all about combat, pew pew, wah wah, the whole thing. And it's got spaceship battles and everything. Now, Star Trek does have spaceship battles, but it doesn't have much in the way of hand-to-hand combat. We get the old double-fisted Kirk punch, some things that made it palatable to the censors on television. And Star Trek has always been more cerebral and more logical, but also philosophical. Some of the episodes in Star Trek, the different series, are absolute heart wrenchers, like very, very emotional, very, very good storytelling. Whereas Star Wars has never really focused on the storytelling as much. Like, I do hear that Andor is a very, very good show as far as that, the serious drama. But Star Wars is more of like a fun thrill ride with, lasers and lightsabers and all of that. And unfortunately, Star Trek doesn't have a lot of fodder for a miniature war game. Number one, even though the Federation is technically a military organization, they really don't like to admit that, with some exceptions. They like to say, oh yeah, we've got photon torpedoes or quantum torpedoes, but really we're explorers and diplomats, is what they like to try to say, despite obviously coming with essentially a warship, to your neighborhood. And so as far as spaceship battles, there's been a ton of Star Trek spaceship battles in all the movies and television shows, and that's why we got things like Star Trek Attack Wing or Star Trek Armada, and even in the past, like Star Trek HeroClix Tactics was spaceships, and things like that, because they're recognizable, they've been shown a lot on screen, this is a runabout, right? And this is a shuttlecraft. You know what these are, right? I think that's a Type 9 shuttlecraft. I could be wrong. And the problem is that Star Trek has never really depicted ground war that much. Now, this could be debated for literally hours, and it has been all over the internet. Does Star Trek wage ground war when you have transporters and photon torpedoes and all of that, sensors that can scan every life form on the entire planet? Well, a real Star Trek fan would tell you that all of that can be scrambled, all of that can be disrupted. The sensors, they can mask warp signatures and everything else. So I really do feel like at some point, if they weren't just trying to firebomb an entire planet, they would have to get down to the ground level, right? In Star Trek Deep Space Nine, one of my favorite series of all time, Star Trek Deep Space Nine depicted the Dominion War, which did have some ground battles. There was some really awesome combat that was shown there, although it was still safe for TV and it wasn't quite as good as the Star Wars ground battles. But one thing that really disappointed me is that they had no armor. They had no, you think you're expecting Stormtrooper-esque armor if you're in all-out battle. It's one thing when Riker and the boys go down to a planet and they end up in a scuffle. Okay, they can be in their jammies, right? They can be in their outfits then. Although that would still be not preferential. But you could see that you got caught up in it. But when you're literally declaring war against the Dominion, you probably should have some better war gear than just your pajamas. And a lot of the combat we saw had no armor, nothing like that. They were using your standard phaser rifles and all of that. And I know that wasn't the focus of the show. The focus of the show was the people and the drama. It wasn't about the tactics and the military doctrine. It really wasn't about that. So I understand why they didn't include that. But that makes very little content for a miniature war game to draw upon. Now, these right here, I all had 3D printed, or I 3D printed myself, and this is for my genre agnostic war game called Mass Brutality. So I can stat these out how I want. This literally is a massive ship in my game. Multiple transport options. They can carry several of these people. Same thing with the shuttlecraft. They can fly, they can shoot missiles, everything. Many of these units down here are different. Some have phasers, some have the phaser rifles. I've got science and medical. I've got engineering, all sorts of stuff. And with Mass Brutality, you can stat all of that out. But even I ran into that when I was trying to get miniatures for it, is that everybody's still on their jammies. Because they never really depicted much armor. Now, they depicted this armor, which is awful, and this was in the 80s, I believe. It might have been the 70s when this came out, but the 80s, and that was a bad take on some sort of futuristic armor. And they've shown some armor, but it was never really Starfleet armor. So they also don't depict tanks. Do they use tanks in Star Trek? We don't really know. They've never spoke about it in the show. Obviously, if you have air superiority with runabouts and shuttlecraft, then they're basically a tank in their self, especially if you up-armored them. So it's really hard to say that you need ground tanks if all of your tanks can just fly. So maybe they don't use ground tanks. Now, I have actually made some of my own. I've got a Cardassian hover tank that I made for my Cardassian army. And they're the only one that I actually made a tank for, but I just thought that was neat. So you really have to be creative when trying to do something with Star Trek. And I understand that Star Trek Online does have some armor options for your troops. So I've seen more and more Star Trek Online, like the Odyssey class, I believe, ship, being introduced into actual Star Trek canon. So I'm wondering if Star Trek Online could not be the template for the armor and things that you could do if you were to make a Star Trek game. Now, the way I statted these guys out in their jammies, they do not have a high save. They just don't. Now, one of my people over here have a shield generator. This lady right here has a shield generator that's hovering, and she can give people some armor, but they don't natively have armor, which makes sense, right? Whereas my Klingon faction and my Cardassians, they have a lot of armor because they literally wear armor. So that makes more sense. But you're going to have to do something like Mass Brutality in order to have a Star Trek game, because you're going to have to take some creative liberties. And I would show you some of these things, but they're not exactly all painted or whatever, so I don't really want to show them off. But the point is that as far as an official canon miniatures game, Star Trek has not given us much to work with. If you want a fleet battle game, they've given us ton. If you want a ground troop game, they've never really delved into that. But like I said, unless you're going to bomb the entire planet, you're going to need ground troops or drones or something. And I would love to see a Star Trek Legion. I would love to see that. Because I think there's a ton of opportunities there. All the different races. Do you know how cool it would be to have Ferengi faction, which is more manipulative and not combat oriented, or the Borg that's super adaptive. Every turn you change their rules, or I statted out the Federation to be more run and gun sort of thing with a lot of powers and science and engineering. But the Cardassians are far more ranged fire oriented, and my Klingons are far more melee oriented. So you can see that there's lots of different ways to do this. And the Romulans, I have not actually done much with my Romulan army, but they're going to be more duplicitous, and think of like Gene Stealer cults sort of thing, where they're coming and going and you don't know where they are necessarily. But anyway, it's a shame that Star Trek fans have not seen a Star Trek Legion, but it's understandable. They've really never given us much. I did see that in Star Trek Discovery, they did have a little bit of plate armor when they went on some away team missions, which made sense. Still didn't have helmets, but what do you do? That's another funny thing is that all of my Star Trek armies, none of them have helmets because they don't in the show and they never wear helmets. So I'm not going to give them helmets. Also, it lets you see that I've got Bolians and Vulcans and Tellarites and Denobulans and Andorians, all of those. So you don't really want to put helmets on because you want to see how diverse all the species are, especially for the Federation. So, what do you think? Do you think a Star Trek Legion could actually work if we use some of the developments from Star Trek Online? I would still love to see it happen. In the meantime, you can make your own Star Trek army with Mass Brutality or Brutality Skirmish Wargame. But I would love to hear what you think. What army would you like to play? If you saw a Star Trek Legion, what army would be your very first army? And you know what? Let's cut out Federation. Cut out Federation altogether. What's your very first army besides the Federation that you would like to play? And personally, I haven't made it yet, but I'm going to make a Ferengi army at some point. And I'm really looking forward to them being completely passive. Just completely dodgy and tactical and passive and not, like no melee. They'd probably all be fast. I do have a Ferengi warband for Brutality. And they're all like fast class, like the different upgrades in the fast class, because I wanted them to, plant bombs and things like that. So you let me know. And thank you to all my beautiful, sexy, good-smelling Patreon patrons. And what is this? We've got the Pepper family. Thank you so much, Peppers, for supporting the show. I greatly appreciate it. I will see you in the comments section. Thank you for liking, subscribing, and sharing. Check out Mass Brutality and Brutality Skirmish Wargame and Brutal Space. Didn't even mention that. If you got Star Trek miniatures like I do, I played a giant 6x4 game of Brutal Space against the Dominion the other day. It's really fun. Oh, I forgot to mention, I got a Dominion army too. Can't think of it all. I'll see you next week.